The people who spend years telling you that you do not belong are sometimes the very ones who leave behind the proof that you always did. The library inside the Reed family estate had never felt so silent. Sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, illuminating rows of leather-bound books that had remained untouched since Evelyn Reed's funeral 3 days earlier. Every member of the Reed family had gathered around the long mahogany table where generations of life-changing decisions had been made. Alexander Reed sat nearest the fireplace, his expression controlled despite the grief he had carefully hidden from the world since losing his mother. As the founder and chief executive officer of Reed Capital Partners, he had spent 2 decades making difficult decisions with calm precision. Yet nothing about that afternoon felt familiar. Across the room, Naomi Brooks Reed quietly folded her hands in her lap. She wore a simple black dress, with no jewelry except the silver wedding band she had never removed. She had arrived early, greeted every house employee by name, and even brought fresh flowers for the portrait of Evelyn, displayed beside the fireplace. No one commented on the gesture. They simply watched her with the same quiet uncertainty that had followed her through 6 years of marriage into one of Boston's most respected families. Other relatives exchanged polite whispers while glancing toward Benjamin Foster, the Reed family's attorney for more than 30 years. Thick folders rested neatly before him, beside a sealed ivory envelope bearing Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. Helen Morris, the family's longtime house manager, stood quietly near the doorway after serving coffee. Unlike everyone else, she never looked surprised by the envelope. Instead, she lowered her eyes as though she already understood the weight of the afternoon that was about to unfold. Benjamin adjusted his glasses before speaking. Mrs. Evelyn Reed revised her final will 6 months before her passing. She instructed me to read every provision exactly as written and without interruption. The room became perfectly still. Several relatives instinctively turned toward Alexander. No one questioned who would inherit the Reed estate. He was the only son, the architect of the family business, and the obvious successor to everything his parents had built. Benjamin slowly opened the legal document and began reading the customary declarations. Family trusts, charitable foundations, historical preservation funds. Everything sounded predictable until he reached the final page. His voice remained steady. After careful consideration and with complete clarity of mind, I leave my personal residence, my private investments, my charitable foundation, and every remaining personal asset under my sole ownership to Naomi Brooks Reed, who shall become the exclusive beneficiary of my estate. Silence settled over the room so completely that the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock suddenly sounded impossibly loud. Alexander stared at the attorney without speaking. Several relatives exchanged stunned expressions, convinced they had misunderstood what they had just heard. Naomi herself looked equally shocked. "There must be some mistake," she said quietly, her voice almost disappearing beneath the silence. Benjamin gently shook his head. Mrs. Reed anticipated that response. He reached toward the sealed ivory envelope resting beside the will and carefully placed it in the center of the table. Across the front, written in Evelyn's elegant handwriting, appeared a single instruction: to be opened only after my final will has been read in full. Helen slowly closed her eyes. Alexander looked from the envelope to Naomi, searching for answers neither of them possessed. Benjamin rested one hand lightly upon the unopened letter before speaking again. Mrs. Reed instructed that what is inside this envelope would explain not only her decision, but the truth she believed every person in this room had failed to see for far too many years. 6 years earlier, the front entrance of the Reed estate had looked just as magnificent, but to Naomi Brooks it felt less like the beginning of a family and more like an examination she could never fully prepare for. The wedding ceremony had ended only an hour before. Friends had celebrated. Cameras had captured smiling photographs. Guests had toasted the future of Alexander Reed and the woman he loved. Yet as the newly married couple stepped across the threshold of the historic mansion overlooking Boston Harbor, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Evelyn Reed stood waiting inside the grand foyer with the same flawless posture that had made generations of business leaders respect her before she ever spoke. She wore a tailored navy suit instead of the soft colors usually chosen for family celebrations, and her expression remained impossible to read. Alexander smiled warmly. "Mother, I wanted us to have a quiet moment together, before everyone arrives for dinner." Evelyn's eyes rested briefly on her son, before turning toward Naomi. "Congratulations," she said politely. The words sounded courteous, but carried no warmth. Naomi answered with the same grace she had practiced throughout the engagement. "Thank you, Mrs. Reed. I appreciate you welcoming me into your home." Evelyn remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "This house has belonged to the Reed family for nearly 90 years. Naomi nodded respectfully. "It is beautiful." Evelyn slowly stepped closer. Beautiful things survive because people understand the difference between entering a house and becoming part of a family. Alexander's smile faded slightly. "Mother." Evelyn lifted one hand, stopping him before he continued. Her attention never left Naomi. "Money can arrange a wedding. Love may even sustain a marriage, but neither guarantees acceptance." The words settled into the quiet hallway with unmistakable clarity. "You may share my son's last name," Evelyn continued calmly, "but do not mistake that for belonging here. Family is something that must be earned over time, and I am not prepared to call you my daughter." Alexander immediately reached for Naomi's hand. "That is enough," he said more firmly than before. "Naomi has done nothing to deserve this." Evelyn looked toward her son without raising her voice. "I am not asking you to agree with me today. I am asking you to remember this conversation years from now." Naomi gently squeezed Alexander's hand before answering herself. "Mrs. Reed," she said quietly, "I did not marry Alexander because I wanted this house, your approval, or your family name. I married him because I love your son." Evelyn studied her for a long moment. Time has a way of testing every declaration people make on their wedding day. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the library, leaving the newlyweds standing alone beneath the crystal chandelier. During dinner that evening, every guest admired the elegance of the celebration. Laughter filled the dining room. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight across polished silver. Yet beneath the polished conversations, Alexander remained distracted by the memory of his mother's words. Several times he considered speaking privately with her, but each attempt was interrupted by relatives, business associates, or old family friends requesting his attention. Naomi noticed his concern and quietly rested her hand over his. "Please do not worry," she whispered with a gentle smile. "Relationships are not built in one evening." Alexander looked at her with grateful affection. "She will come around." Naomi nodded, believing him because she wanted to believe in the future they had promised each other only hours earlier. As the evening drew to a close, Helen Morris quietly approached Naomi near the front staircase while helping collect guests' coats. "Do not lose heart, dear," she said softly. "Mrs. Reed has spent her entire life protecting this family. Sometimes people who protect something too fiercely forget how to welcome someone new." Naomi smiled kindly. "Then I will give her all the time she needs." Helen watched the young bride disappear upstairs beside Alexander, silently wondering whether kindness alone could survive a test neither of them yet understood was only beginning. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that revealed far more about character than any grand declaration ever could. Naomi Brooks Reed never tried to persuade Evelyn Reed to like her. She never defended herself against cold remarks or searched for opportunities to impress the family. Instead, she simply continued living according to the values that had shaped her long before she married Alexander. Every Tuesday evening after finishing work at Boston General Hospital, she stopped by the Reed estate carrying fresh groceries because Helen had once mentioned that Evelyn preferred homemade soup to catered meals during long work weeks. She never announced that she had prepared it herself. She simply left the containers in the kitchen before quietly returning home. Helen noticed every visit. Evelyn never acknowledged them. One rainy afternoon, Alexander called Naomi from Chicago after a board meeting unexpectedly ran late. "I may miss Mother's annual foundation dinner tonight," he admitted with disappointment. "Would you mind representing us?" Naomi smiled gently. "Of course." She arrived at the charity event nearly an hour early, helping volunteers arrange place cards, greet donors, and organize silent auction items without introducing herself as the daughter-in-law of the event's founder. Most guests assumed she was simply another volunteer because she worked beside everyone else instead of directing them. Throughout the evening, Evelyn observed quietly from across the ballroom. Several influential donors praised Naomi's warmth and professionalism without realizing the connection between the two women. Evelyn accepted their compliments with polite silence. On the drive home, neither woman spoke much. Finally, as the car approached the estate, Evelyn looked through the rain-covered window and said calmly, "People seem to enjoy your company tonight." Naomi smiled. "It was a wonderful event. Your foundation has helped many families." Evelyn nodded once before returning her attention to the dark road ahead. It was not gratitude, but it was the first sentence she had spoken to Naomi that did not contain distance. Months later, during a routine medical examination, Evelyn's physician recommended additional cardiac monitoring after discovering irregular heart rhythms. Alexander happened to be leading negotiations in London when the appointment was scheduled. Naomi quietly rearranged her own calendar and drove Evelyn to every follow-up consultation without mentioning it to anyone. During long waits inside hospital corridors, Naomi never filled the silence with unnecessary conversation. She simply sat nearby reading, while making certain Evelyn never faced appointments alone. One afternoon, the cardiologist entered the waiting room, running nearly an hour behind schedule. Naomi noticed Evelyn rubbing one hand against her shoulder with obvious discomfort. Without saying anything, she walked to the hospital cafe, returned with warm tea prepared exactly the way Helen had once described, and placed it beside Evelyn. "Thank you," Evelyn said almost automatically, before realizing the words had escaped her. Naomi smiled kindly. "You are welcome." Neither woman spoke again for several minutes, yet the silence somehow felt different. It no longer resembled a closed door. It felt more like a conversation. Neither of them yet knew how to begin. Later that evening, Helen found Evelyn standing alone inside the library, looking at an old family photograph displayed above the fireplace. "Mrs. Reed," Helen asked gently, "shall I prepare your evening tea?" Evelyn remained focused on the photograph. "Naomi remembered exactly how I take it today." Helen smiled softly. "She remembers many things." Evelyn answered quietly, almost as though speaking to herself instead of anyone else. "People can perform kindness when they expect to be noticed." Helen waited patiently. Evelyn continued after a thoughtful pause. "The more difficult test is discovering who they become when no one is watching." Upstairs, Naomi and Alexander returned home hours later, unaware that the brief exchange downstairs had become the first small crack in a wall Evelyn had spent a lifetime believing could never be lowered. Nearly 4 years passed before anyone inside the Reed family noticed that the greatest changes had not happened during dramatic moments, but during ordinary afternoons that quietly disappeared into memory. Evelyn Reed's health remained stable enough for her to continue leading the family's charitable foundation, yet age gradually asked more of her than she was willing to admit. She attended fewer public events, shortened long meetings, and occasionally paused while climbing the wide staircase inside the estate she had once crossed without effort. Alexander remained deeply devoted to both his company and his mother, but the rapid expansion of Reed Capital Partners demanded frequent travel throughout the United States and Europe. Every delayed flight and unexpected board meeting convinced him that he would make more time once the next quarter became less demanding. Naomi never argued with his schedule. She simply adjusted hers whenever the family needed someone present. On quiet Wednesday mornings before reporting to Boston General Hospital, she often stopped by the estate carrying breakfast from the neighborhood bakery Evelyn secretly preferred over the expensive catering ordered for formal occasions. If Evelyn had already left for meetings, Naomi placed the pastries beside a handwritten note reminding her not to skip lunch. Helen noticed that every note disappeared before the afternoon staff arrived, yet none of them ever appeared in the household trash. One autumn evening, Evelyn experienced unusual dizziness while reviewing foundation documents inside her library. Helen immediately called Naomi because Alexander's flight from San Francisco had been delayed by severe weather. Naomi arrived within 20 minutes, calmly helping Evelyn settle into a comfortable chair before speaking with her physician over the telephone. The doctor recommended observation at the hospital as a precaution. During the drive, Evelyn looked quietly through the passenger window, while city lights reflected across the windshield. "You should have stayed with your husband," she said without turning her head. Naomi smiled gently while keeping her attention on the road. "Alexander would have wanted someone here with you." Evelyn remained silent until they reached the hospital entrance. The overnight evaluation revealed nothing immediately serious, and by the following afternoon, Evelyn was cleared to return home with adjustments to her medication and a recommendation to avoid unnecessary stress. Alexander rushed directly from the airport to the hospital carrying flowers, an obvious concern. "Why did nobody wake me sooner?" he asked, frustrated with himself. Naomi answered before anyone else could. "There was nothing you could have done from 30,000 feet. Your mother needed someone beside her, not someone feeling guilty across the country." Alexander embraced his mother before thanking Naomi for everything she had done. Evelyn watched the exchange without saying a word. A week later, after returning to the estate, Evelyn asked Helen to bring several old family albums down from the attic storage room. Together they spent the afternoon organizing photographs for an upcoming foundation anniversary display. As Helen carefully dusted each album, one loose photograph slipped onto the carpet. It showed Naomi laughing beside Evelyn during a community garden volunteer day nearly 2 years earlier. Neither woman appeared aware that anyone had taken the picture. They were simply planting flowers together beneath bright spring sunshine. Helen bent down to retrieve it, but Evelyn gently stopped her. She picked up the photograph herself and studied it for several quiet moments. "She did not know this picture existed," Evelyn said thoughtfully. "No, ma'am," Helen replied. Evelyn carefully placed the photograph inside the top drawer of her writing desk, instead of returning it to the album. "Some moments deserve to be kept close," she murmured almost to herself. Late that evening, after the household had grown quiet, Alexander entered the library hoping to discuss business matters with his mother. He noticed the photograph resting beside her reading glasses before she quietly slipped it into the drawer and closed it without explanation. He considered asking why she had hidden a picture of Naomi, but the expression on Evelyn's face told him she was protecting a thought she was not yet ready to share, and for reasons he could not explain, he suddenly realized he knew far less about the relationship between the two women than he had always assumed. Benjamin Foster slowly lifted the ivory envelope from the polished mahogany table, carefully breaking the wax seal exactly as Evelyn Reed had instructed months before her passing. Every pair of eyes followed his hands. The silence inside the library felt almost sacred, interrupted only by the quiet crackling of the fireplace and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock that had stood in the Reed estate for generations. Benjamin unfolded several handwritten pages before looking toward Naomi Brooks Reed. "Mrs. Reed requested that these words be read exactly as she wrote them," he said softly. Then he began, "If you are hearing this letter, I am no longer here to explain my decision myself. Some of you will believe I made an emotional choice. Others will think I made a mistake. Neither is true. I simply had more time than the rest of you to observe what real character looks like when nobody believes they are being watched." Benjamin paused briefly before continuing. "For years, I told Naomi she would never become part of this family. Those words belong to one of the greatest regrets of my life. I believed protecting my family's legacy required keeping my heart closed. Instead, I nearly failed to recognize the very person who protected that legacy better than anyone else." Alexander lowered his eyes as Benjamin continued reading. "My son believes he spent those years building our future. I know how hard he worked because I once lived the same way. What he never saw were the ordinary afternoons after his flights departed. Naomi drove me to doctor's appointments without mentioning them to anyone. She sat beside me during long hospital examinations, read foundation reports aloud when my eyesight became unreliable, canceled weekends with friends whenever Helen quietly told her I was pretending to feel stronger than I truly did, and never once reminded me that I had given her every reason to walk away." Naomi remained perfectly still, her hands resting quietly in her lap, as though the letter described someone else entirely. Benjamin turned to the next page. There were evenings when I deliberately spoke harshly because I wanted to know whether kindness was simply another performance. Every single time, Naomi answered disrespect with patience. She never argued. She never defended herself. She simply returned the next day asking whether I had eaten lunch or remembered my medication. I slowly realized something that took me far too many years to understand. Blood may explain how a family begins, but character determines who truly belongs inside it. Helen quietly wiped away tears she had made no effort to hide. Several relatives stared toward Naomi with expressions that slowly shifted from disbelief to quiet reflection. Benjamin continued, "I also know something else that almost no one in this room knows. During the winter my heart condition worsened. I asked Naomi one difficult question. I told her she was free to leave this family if my son continued choosing work over the people waiting at home. She smiled and answered that marriage was not measured by the easiest seasons, but by the willingness to remain kind during the hardest ones. She asked me not to tell Alexander, because she never wanted gratitude for simply honoring the promises she had already made." Alexander closed his eyes as the words settled over him with overwhelming clarity. Benjamin reached the final page. "That is why I leave everything I built to Naomi. Not because she needs my wealth, not because she married my son. I leave it to her because every meaningful part of this family's legacy already lived inside her long before I found the courage to admit she had become the daughter I spent years insisting I would never have." Benjamin carefully lowered the final page onto the table. No one spoke. Across the room, Alexander slowly turned toward Naomi, seeing not the inheritance she had unexpectedly received, but the years of quiet devotion he had unknowingly overlooked, while believing he understood everything happening inside his own family. The guests gradually left the library in respectful silence, each carrying away a different understanding of the woman they believed they had known. Benjamin Foster remained behind to organize the legal documents, while Helen Morris quietly collected untouched cups of coffee that had long since grown cold. Naomi still sat where she had been throughout the reading, unable to reconcile the memory of Evelyn's distant words with the unexpected tenderness revealed inside the letter. Across the room, Alexander Reed stood before the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, staring into the fading afternoon light without seeing it. For the first time in his life, success offered him no comfort because he had just discovered that the person he loved most had quietly lived through years he had never truly noticed. After several minutes, Helen approached him, carrying a small leather notebook wrapped carefully in a linen cloth. "Mrs. Reed asked me to give this to you only after the letter had been read," she said gently. Alexander accepted it with trembling hands. "What is it?" Helen smiled sadly. "Your mother's personal journal. She began writing in it after her first hospital stay." Alone inside his father's old study, Alexander slowly opened the worn notebook. The earliest pages described business meetings, charitable projects, and ordinary reflections about growing older. Then one entry immediately caught his attention. "Naomi insisted on driving me to the cardiologist again today. I reminded her she had already worked a full shift at the hospital. She answered that caring for people does not become less important simply because the clock says the workday has ended." Alexander turned another page. "She believes I do not notice the handwritten notes she leaves beside my medication every Wednesday morning. She is mistaken. I keep every one of them." Another page followed. "Today I deliberately criticized the flowers she planted in the garden because I wanted to see whether kindness survived disappointment. She smiled, thanked me for the advice, and quietly replanted them the next afternoon without mentioning the conversation again. I am beginning to fear that the flaw I keep searching for belongs not to her, but to me." Alexander lowered the journal into his lap, overcome by the realization that his mother's heart had begun changing years before she ever allowed anyone to see it. As evening settled across the estate, he walked slowly toward the sunroom, where Naomi stood alone, looking out across the frozen garden. She heard his footsteps, but did not turn immediately. "I did not know," Alexander said quietly. Naomi remained silent for a moment before answering. "I know." He looked at her with visible regret. "Why did you never tell me about the appointments, the evenings, the foundation work, or everything you did for my mother?" Naomi finally faced him with the same calm expression that had carried her through 6 difficult years. Because none of it was something I did for recognition. Alexander shook his head. You carried this family while I believed I was protecting it. Naomi smiled gently, though sadness lingered behind her eyes. You were building a future for everyone you loved. I never wanted you to choose between your responsibilities and your mother, because I believed she deserved someone beside her, and I happened to have the time. Alexander looked down, struggling to forgive himself. I should have seen it, Naomi answered softly. Sometimes the people closest to us become invisible because we believe they will always be there. Her words settled heavily between them because both understood they reached far beyond the conversation they were having. Alexander reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed one folded page from Evelyn's journal. There is one entry I cannot stop reading, he admitted. He handed it to Naomi. Written near the bottom of the page were Evelyn's final reflections on the woman she had once refused to call family. The greatest mistake of my life was believing that belonging could be decided by the person opening the front door. Naomi never asked to enter this family. She quietly became its strongest foundation, while the rest of us were too distracted to notice. Naomi closed the journal page with trembling fingers, tears quietly filling her eyes for the first time since Evelyn's funeral. Outside, snow continued falling across the garden Evelyn had loved, while inside the house she had spent years protecting. The truth she left behind had finally begun healing the people she loved most. The weeks following the reading of Evelyn Reed's will changed the rhythm of the Reed estate in ways that no legal document alone ever could. Reporters speculated about the unexpected inheritance. Business journals questioned the decision, and distant relatives quietly wondered whether Naomi Brooks Reed would sell the historic property and begin a different life. Instead, every morning looked almost exactly as it had before. Naomi still arrived early at Boston General Hospital, still volunteered at the charitable foundation every Thursday afternoon, and still greeted every employee at the estate by name whenever she visited. The inheritance had changed her circumstances, but it had not changed her character. Alexander Reed noticed the quiet consistency with growing humility. For years he had believed extraordinary achievements defined extraordinary people. Now he realized that the strongest measure of character often appeared inside routines so ordinary they attracted no attention at all. One evening, while reviewing financial reports inside the foundation office, Naomi found Alexander waiting outside with 2 paper cups of coffee from the neighborhood cafe they had visited during the earliest months of their marriage. I was not sure whether you would still remember my order, she said with a faint smile. Alexander handed her the cup. Medium coffee with a little honey instead of sugar. Naomi accepted it, surprised that he had remembered after so many years. They walked slowly through the foundation gardens without speaking for several minutes. Winter had begun giving way to early spring, and the first green shoots pushed quietly through the soil Evelyn had always insisted should be cared for by hand rather than machines. I owe you more apologies than I know how to express, Alexander finally said. Naomi looked ahead toward the rows of flowering trees. You do not owe me perfect words. Alexander stopped walking. Then let me give you honest ones. I spent years believing that remaining silent kept peace inside my family. I understand now that silence can also leave good people standing alone. Naomi nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes it can. He lowered his eyes. Every time my mother questioned you, I convinced myself there would be another opportunity to fix things later. I kept postponing conversations that should never have been delayed. Naomi turned toward him with quiet kindness. Your mother and I both made our own choices. You cannot carry responsibility for every decision another person made. Alexander smiled sadly. No, but I can accept responsibility for the decisions I made. The following weekend, the board of the Evelyn Reed Foundation held its first meeting since the reading of the will. Several trustees expected Naomi to appoint herself chairwoman immediately. Instead, she proposed expanding the foundation's mission to include additional health services for elderly people living alone, inspired by the countless ordinary moments she had shared with Evelyn during hospital visits and routine appointments. Every proposal emphasized service rather than recognition. When one trustee praised her generosity, Naomi quietly answered, "Mrs. Reed taught me that a legacy should continue helping people long after we are no longer here to receive credit." Helen Morris watched from the back of the conference room with quiet pride. After the meeting ended, she approached Naomi, carrying a small wooden box she had discovered while organizing Evelyn's personal belongings. "Mrs. Reed left this inside her desk with your name written underneath," Helen explained. Naomi slowly opened the lid. Inside rested the faded photograph of herself and Evelyn planting flowers together years earlier, along with a handwritten note folded beneath it. The note contained only one sentence: "Thank you for never giving up on someone who first gave you every reason to walk away." Naomi gently closed the box, holding it close without speaking. Across the room, Alexander saw the tears quietly gathering in her eyes and understood that the greatest inheritance Evelyn had left behind was never measured in property or wealth. It was the courage to tell the truth before another generation repeated the same silence that had almost cost their family everything. Spring arrived with gentle rain and longer evenings, bringing new life to the gardens surrounding the Reed estate and to the charitable foundation Evelyn Reed had spent decades building. 3 months had passed since the reading of the will, and although newspapers had eventually found newer stories to pursue, the quiet transformation inside the Reed family continued every single day. Naomi Brooks Reed never treated the inheritance as a personal victory. She continued arriving at the foundation before sunrise several mornings each week, reviewing scholarship applications, expanding community outreach programs, and personally meeting with elderly residents whose lives had been touched by the organization. Staff members quickly noticed that the new director preferred listening before making decisions. She asked receptionists what families needed most. She thanked volunteers individually after every event. She insisted that every donation be measured not by its dollar amount, but by the number of lives it could improve. The culture of the foundation slowly changed because kindness, once demonstrated quietly by one person, had become the standard for everyone. Alexander Reed watched those changes with growing admiration. One afternoon, he entered the conference room, expecting to discuss financial forecasts for the foundation's annual budget. Instead, he found Naomi speaking with a group of social workers about expanding transportation services for elderly patients who regularly missed medical appointments because they could no longer drive. She listened carefully to every concern before adjusting the proposal herself. Making certain practical solutions came before impressive presentations. As the meeting ended, one longtime trustee approached Alexander privately. "Your mother always believed leadership meant protecting what already existed," he said thoughtfully. "Naomi has shown us that leadership also means helping something become even better." Alexander smiled quietly, because he knew the compliment would have meant more to Naomi than any headline celebrating the inheritance. Later that evening, Alexander and Naomi walked through the estate gardens where Evelyn had once spent countless afternoons tending roses by hand. The flower beds had begun blooming again, filling the air with the familiar fragrance that reminded them both of quieter years. Alexander stopped beside the stone bench where his mother often rested after working outside. "I used to believe success meant solving every problem myself," he admitted. "Now I realize the greatest failures in my life came from the moments I assumed someone else was carrying the emotional weight without needing me." Naomi looked across the garden before answering. "We cannot change the years behind us. We can only decide what kind of people those years allow us to become." Alexander nodded slowly. "I do not expect you to forget everything." Naomi smiled gently. "Forgetting is not the same as healing." They continued walking until they reached the small memorial garden dedicated to Evelyn. Fresh white lilies surrounded a simple bronze plaque, engraved with her name and the dates that marked her remarkable life. Naomi carefully placed a small bouquet of wildflowers beside the memorial, flowers she had gathered herself instead of purchasing from an expensive florist. "She would have liked these," Alexander said softly. Naomi smiled. She always said gardens should look alive, not arranged. The familiar sentence made them both laugh quietly, remembering how often Evelyn had insisted on small details others overlooked. Before leaving, Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded sheet of paper. "I have been working on something," he said. Naomi unfolded it carefully. It was a proposal asking the Reed Foundation Board to rename its annual humanitarian award in honor of Evelyn Reed, with future recipients chosen not for public recognition or financial achievement, but for years of quiet service performed without seeking attention. Naomi looked up, deeply moved. "This sounds exactly like the lesson your mother wanted everyone to remember." Alexander smiled with quiet gratitude. "No, it sounds like the lesson both of you spent years trying to teach me." As they walked back toward the house beneath the fading evening light, neither of them spoke again, because some forms of healing no longer required words. They only required two people willing to keep choosing understanding over pride, one ordinary day after another, until forgiveness quietly became part of everyday life. 1 year later, the Reed Foundation welcomed hundreds of guests to the opening of the Evelyn Reed Center for Healthy Aging, a place created not to celebrate wealth, but to honor compassion, expressed through ordinary acts of service. The historic brick building stood only a few miles from the neighborhood where Evelyn had begun her earliest charitable work decades before. Inside, bright community rooms overlooked peaceful gardens. Medical consultation offices welcomed older adults regardless of financial circumstances, and volunteers prepared daily programs designed to ensure that no one faced aging alone. Naomi Brooks Reed arrived before sunrise, just as she always had before every important event. She walked through each room greeting nurses, social workers, volunteers, and maintenance staff by name, thanking them individually for the countless hours they had devoted to making Evelyn's final dream a reality. The inheritance that had once shocked an entire family had quietly become something far greater than anyone expected. It had become hope shared with thousands of strangers. Alexander Reed stood near the entrance, watching Naomi move naturally from one conversation to another. She never behaved like someone who owned the foundation. She behaved like someone entrusted with protecting it. During the past year, he had gradually reshaped his own life as well. Business success remained important, but it no longer determined every decision he made. He attended foundation meetings himself instead of sending representatives. He declined speaking engagements that conflicted with family commitments. He spent evenings at home more often than inside corporate boardrooms. For the first time since beginning his career, people who worked beside him noticed that the word balance had become something he practiced instead of merely admired. As guests gathered inside the main hall, Benjamin Foster stepped onto the stage to introduce the dedication ceremony. Behind him hung a large portrait of Evelyn Reed, smiling gently in a way few people had ever witnessed during her earlier years. Benjamin spoke briefly about the foundation's history before inviting Alexander to deliver the opening remarks. Alexander looked across the audience before beginning. "For many years, I believed my mother's greatest legacy was the business she helped build," he said quietly. "I eventually learned that I was wrong. Her greatest legacy was teaching us that character is revealed most clearly when kindness continues, even after appreciation never arrives." His voice remained steady, though emotion softened every word. "The woman standing beside me today taught my mother that lesson long before any of us recognized it. She never asked to become part of our family. She simply chose to love us with patience until we finally understood that she already was." The audience turned toward Naomi as warm applause gradually filled the room. She smiled modestly, lowering her eyes exactly as she always did whenever praise found her. After the ceremony ended, guests wandered through the gardens where children planted flowers alongside older volunteers, symbolizing the connection between generations that Evelyn had hoped to preserve. Helen Morris quietly approached Naomi, carrying a newly framed photograph. It was the same picture taken years earlier while Naomi and Evelyn planted flowers together beneath the spring sunshine. This time, however, another photograph had been placed beside it. It showed the entire Reed family gathered outside the new center that very morning. Alexander stood beside Naomi with quiet pride. Helen smiled warmly behind them. Benjamin rested one hand upon the dedication plaque, and above them all hung Evelyn's portrait overlooking the entrance, as though watching the family she had finally learned to see clearly. Naomi held the frame gently before looking toward the memorial garden where white roses bloomed beneath the afternoon sun. She no longer felt the need to prove she belonged, because belonging had never depended upon another person's permission. It had been built through years of quiet choices, unwavering grace, and compassion offered without expectation. As the afternoon drew to a peaceful close, Alexander slipped his hand into Naomi's. She smiled back, not because the past had disappeared, but because they had both allowed it to transform them into better people. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by a legacy no longer measured in wealth, but in love honestly lived, the Reed family finally understood that the strongest inheritance anyone could leave behind was not a fortune waiting inside a will, but a life that taught others how to become family, long before anyone found the courage to say the words aloud.